We'll start by just talking about some of these structures that are part of the female reproductive system, their function, some general information. So, sort of like equivalent to the male testes are the female ovaries, although in some ways it's not the best analogy, but the function of the ovaries is to produce or release egg cells, as well as some of the hormones that are necessary for the regulation of the reproductive cycle. There's an interesting difference between the, oh yeah, you guys have to change, there's it shouldn't say testosterone. I edited it here, but it's not edited on your sheet. So in males, sperm cells are constantly produced, like we talked about, hundreds of millions, and they're continually produced after puberty. However, things are different in women. The egg cells that a woman will release throughout her lifetime are all present from birth. They start developing while the fetus is still growing inside of the womb. And then what happens is those egg cells that are developing in the ovaries, they start meiosis to produce mature egg cells, but then meiosis sort of stops and freezes for a while until puberty. And then once puberty starts and the egg cell starts to sort of finish up meiosis, develop into a mature egg cell which can be fertilized and grow from there. But all the egg cells are there and present from birth in the female ovary. No new egg cells develop after that. No new egg cells can be produced. And so they're all there. And there's sort of a limited number of egg cells in the ovary.
So you're saying that the egg will be fertilized after puberty, but I read like a few stories about like girls getting
Oh, really? Well, there is like early onset puberty. So sometimes there's like, I think it's like a hormonal disorder in which girls can start to go through puberty very, very young. And that would probably be that situation when they went through, I forget what the name for it is, but they went through puberty very, very early, and then once they start producing egg cells, it is possible to become pregnant. So the ovaries are in the abdomen. They're about 1 inch in diameter. And like I said, they contain all of the immature eggs at birth. And they also, the ovaries produce some of the hormones related to the regulation of the menstrual cycle and the development of female secondary sex characteristics. The egg cells themselves, the egg is the female gamete. And inside of the ovaries are held within sort of little bubbles almost, little cavities called the follicle. And so after puberty, once every month or so, 28 days, the follicles start to mature one at a time. So typically a woman will release just one egg, one mature egg at a time. Sometimes it could be 2, sometimes it could be more, but typically it's just one egg cell being released from the ovary each reproductive cycle. From the ovary, it travels through the oviduct. So we have the ovaries, left and a right ovary. And then, not quite attached to the ovary is the oviduct or fallopian tube. So they're not physically connected. It's not like there's a tube that directly attaches to the ovary. They actually have these sort of feathery fringes called the fimbriae. And inside of the oviduct are cilia, which sort of move the egg cell into the fallopian tube and transport it. So the egg matures inside of the follicle. During ovulation, it gets released into the oviduct or fallopian tubes, and then slowly travels down the fallopian tube and into the uterus. The uterus is sort of a muscular organ that can expand drastically in size. So when a woman is pregnant, like at the end stage of the pregnancy, and her abdomen is distended, basically her uterus has swollen up inside of her abdomen because it contains the amniotic sac and the fetus as it grows. So it can expand, and then after birth will shrink back down to normal size again. So it receives the embryo. The uterus is where the embryo will grow and develop. If a woman becomes pregnant, the embryo will attach to the lining of the uterus, and that's where it will stay until it's born. The opening of the uterus is the cervix. So the hollow organ is the uterus, and the bottom is the cervix. It leads to the vagina. And the cervix is when you hear a woman that's like going through labor or and having a baby, they might talk about dilation. Like, has the woman dilated to 3 centimeters or 6 or 8 or 10 centimeters? The cervix during childbirth has to dilate or open up to allow the fetus to come through. So when you hear about dilation, they're talking about the cervix. The other reason you probably have heard of cervix is cervical cancer is a fairly common type of cancer. And if you've been vaccinated with the Gardasil vaccine, the HPV vaccine, have you guys heard of that? So HPV is a virus, human papillomavirus, and it's transmitted sexually, and it's extremely common. Okay? Something like 90-something% of individuals that are sexually active have HPV virus. And HPV virus, one of the effects when a woman gets it is that it drastically increases the risk of cervical cancer. And so in the last maybe 10 years or so, this HPV vaccine has come out, and nowadays most people get the HPV vaccine, and what that should do is drastically reduce the incidence of cervical cancer in women. So if you hear about that, the brand name is Gardasil, that vaccine, that's its purpose, is to prevent cervical cancer or to reduce the incidence of cervical cancer. So from the cervix attaches the vagina, the tube that is the birth canal, where when the fetus is born will come through the vagina. It's also where sperm are deposited during intercourse. And typically, as we talked about with males, hundreds of millions of sperm cells are deposited in the vagina during sex. Only a couple dozen or so will actually make their way to the egg. We'll talk more about fertilization, but fertilization happens up here, somewhere in the fallopian tube. And so sperm cells need to make their way, for a tiny little sperm cell needs to make its way from the vagina, through the cervix, through the uterus, all the way into the fallopian tube to reach the egg. So not many sperm cells actually make it out that way. But we'll talk more about that. So let's talk about the reproductive cycle, the menstrual cycle you might call it. So this is a sort of monthly cycle that happens in women after puberty. So once puberty has happened, a woman will begin her menstrual cycle. And again, puberty can vary drastically from, the early stages, like 8 to later stages, 16, 18 years old. It ends eventually as well. So menopause is when a woman's reproductive cycle stops. So we'll go through a monthly reproductive cycle until some point in her, could be 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and then the reproductive cycle generally stops, and that's what menopause is. And it can vary significantly. Sometimes the reproductive cycle can stop for a while in a woman. It varies based on pregnancy, on age, on stress, on diet, on all sorts of different factors. And in some women it's very regular and happens on a set cycle, a certain number of days, typically around 28 to 30 or 32. In other women it varies quite a bit from month to month. It just sort of depends on each individual. And so we're going to talk about the stages. And the female reproductive health is really complex. And it is regulated by a series of hormones, even more than the 4 that we're going to talk about today. And these hormone levels fluctuate throughout the reproductive cycle, and the hormones sort of signal for different changes to happen within the body. And again, this is because the female reproductive cycle has to allow for the maturing of an egg, the release of the egg, fertilization, and then the pregnancy and development of that embryo, or the renewal of the cycle again. So it's pretty complex. The beginning stage is the follicle stage. And the follicle stage could last 10 to 14 days or so. And it is sort of regulated by a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. FSH is produced in the pituitary gland. Remember where that is? Where's the pituitary gland? Yeah, it's in your brain, okay, at the base of your brain. The pituitary gland is responsible for lots of hormones, but one of them is FSH. Okay? And what FSH does is, as the levels of FSH increase in the blood, the pituitary releases FSH into the blood, travels all throughout the woman's body. What happens when FSH reaches the ovary? How does it only affect the ovaries? Let's make a link back to things we've been talking about. Yeah, because the ovary has receptor molecules that fit in with the FSH hormone. So as this hormone is going throughout the blood, it attaches to receptor molecules in the ovary, signaling for the changes that are going to happen. And so what it does when it signals those changes, the immature follicle, that, like I said, they're all present already in the ovary, it stimulates one of them to begin growing and developing. So one of these follicles starts to enlarge, and inside of it is an egg cell. That starts to mature. Sort of the end stages of meiosis finish up in that immature egg. But also, as that follicle is growing and maturing inside of the ovary, it's producing its own hormones. It's producing estrogen. And so estrogen also has effects. Now, one of the main effects of estrogen is it causes the lining of the uterus, the interior, to start to thicken. And it causes blood vessels to start to grow into the lining of the uterus. So there's sort of these two hormones we're talking about now. So as that stages progress, we could think about two things happening. So the egg is developing, getting ready to be released. At the same time, the lining of the uterus is thickening. What's that getting ready for? Why is the lining of the uterus thickening and growing blood vessels? Yeah, it's getting ready for pregnancy. So around halfway through the cycle, ovulation happens. So a combination of several hormones sort of spiking is what brings about the release of the egg cell during ovulation. So estrogen, LH, and FSH all spike before ovulation, and that causes the follicle to go to the sort of surface of the ovary, break open, and release the egg cell into the fallopian. One of the other hormones that's produced by the pituitary gland that's responsible for this is called LH, luteinizing hormone. Okay? It's also responsible for the development in the next stage. So after the follicle is broken open, it's released the egg cell, it turns into something called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is a mass of cells within the ovary that forms after the follicle released the egg, the corpus luteum forms. And it produces hormones called progesterone. And as long as progesterone levels stay high, okay, new follicles don't form, and the lining of the uterus stays thickened, stays enriched with blood vessels. But what happens if the woman is pregnant? What if that egg that was released was fertilized and attaches to the lining of the uterus? Does the next stage happen? Now, how does a woman know oftentimes? What's like the first thing that says, oh, maybe I'm pregnant? Yeah, she doesn't get her period. Menstruation doesn't happen. That's because there's an embryo there. there's an embryo attached to the lining of the uterus. If she were to menstruate, the embryo would detach along with the lining and she would no longer be pregnant. So if fertilization has happened, if there's an embryo present, then this stage doesn't progress. And a woman won't get her period throughout all of her pregnancy, even after she gives birth. Oftentimes she won't have her period for a time after that. And if a woman is breastfeeding her children, typically she won't get her period back until she's weaned her children. This is sort of an evolutionary adaptation. How do you think that's a useful adaptation if we think about evolution? Why doesn't a woman start her reproductive cycle until after weaning her newborn? Dean? Yeah, because ideally for the survival of the newborn, it wouldn't be very good if she were pregnant and she had a 2-month-old baby, right? To care for, to provide enough nutrients to nurse her young, and also the nutrients she needs for that fetus to grow and develop certainly would not be ideal. So typically she's not fertile again. Her reproductive cycle doesn't restart until she's weaned that newborn child. But oftentimes the egg is released, but it's not fertilized. So if the egg is not fertilized, then menstruation happens. So because this corpus luteum breaks down, progesterone levels start to tail off and decrease, and the lining of the uterus starts to become thinner and eventually breaks down. And that's what menstruation is. That's what the menstrual period is. The lining of the uterus is no longer needed. There's no embryo there. And so it breaks down. It breaks away from the lining of the uterus and is shed through the vagina. And that's what the menstrual period is. Removal of that lining, and that sort of restarts the whole process again. Okay? A new follicle will start to grow and develop. The lining of the uterus will start to thicken again. Ovulation will take place. If there's no pregnancy, then menstruation. And that process repeats cycle after cycle. So a couple diagrams here to kind of bring this all together. This one on the left sort of shows an overall view of what's happening during the different stages of the menstrual cycle. So we're going from day 1 to day 28 with ovulation in the middle. So this first one is something we haven't talked about, body temperature. So a woman's body temperature changes with her menstrual cycle. In the initial stages, while the follicle is developing, it's lower. And then as ovulation takes place, there's a rise in body temperature. And then it stays elevated for the next stages, the luteal phase. And so some women use this change in body temperature to sort of manage their fertility. So some women that want to get pregnant might be tracking their body temperature and know sort of their baseline body temperature, figure out how it changes as she ovulates and reaches the luteal phase, and then use that signal to try to get pregnant. So obviously, if a woman has sex around the time of ovulation, that's when she's going to get pregnant. And so a couple trying to have a child might try to time intercourse to coincide with that elevated body temperature. At the same time, some women, it's not very reliable, really, but use this same concept to avoid pregnancy, so that they avoid sex during the time when their body temperature is increasing, trying to limit the possibility of getting pregnant because they haven't had sex in that time around ovulation. The hormone levels. If we look, this shows the 4 hormones we've talked about. So we have FSH, LH, estrogen. And for those, the levels start off at a relatively low level. Okay? And then right before ovulation, what we see is this spike in LH, FSH, and estrogen reaches its peak just before ovulation. Okay? That surge in those three hormones together is what bring about ovulation. And after they peak, ovulation happens, and then the levels sort of drop off, especially for LH and FSH, and then the level of progesterone stays high. Because remember, progesterone is a hormone that regulates the lining of the uterus. So that levels stay high to support the lining, to support the embryo, which potentially could be implanted. The ovary, this is the development of the follicle. So we see the immature follicle. The follicle starts to grow and develop. The egg inside of it is developing during ovulation. The follicle breaks open, releasing the egg, and then forms the corpus luteum stage, which finishes out the cycle. Then finally, the last section is the ovary, or the uterus, I'm sorry, and the lining of the uterus. So the lining thickens, getting ready for a pregnancy, and then if pregnancy doesn't happen, menstruation and the shed of that uterine lining. So there's three diagrams in your notes. They all kind of show the same sort of thing. It's showing the release of hormones, the feedback which regulates those hormones, and the changes in the body that come about through the reproductive cycle. I'm going to sort of skip over these two, and I'll just talk about this one. They all sort of show the same thing. So I like some better than others. Some are simpler, some are more complex. This one's pretty complex, but it also gives you the explanation here on the right. So we start in the brain, okay, with step one here. So GnRH is a hormone that regulates the pituitary gland. And as we said, the pituitary gland, it's producing FSH. That's what this orange line, so I'm sort of simplifying this. These hormones have effects in several places in the body, but for our purposes, we're going to say FSH has its main effects on the ovaries. Okay? And as FSH is circulated to the ovaries, it causes the follicles to start to mature. Again, in those follicles are a single egg cell. And that egg cell, that follicle itself produces its own hormones, estrogen. And so estrogen feeds back to the pituitary gland. Talked in our last unit about feedback. And as FSH, as estrogen increases, that actually lowers FSH and starts LH, a luteinizing hormone. The estrogen also helps begin the preparation of the uterus for pregnancy. So as estrogen is causing LH to increase, we have that surge. If you remember that graph, that spike in those hormones. The LH surge is what prompts the ovulation, the follicle to break open, releasing that egg cell. In step 7, okay, that corpus luteum that forms after the follicle has released the egg, okay, that's producing progesterone. Okay? And that progesterone slows down LH, so that's feedback. It also maintains the lining of the uterus, keeping it thickened, waiting for this egg to be fertilized and implanted. And finally, if the egg is fertilized, okay, then the progesterone levels stay high. If it's not, then menstruation happens. And that lining of the uterus is shed, and then we're back to step 1 again. And that repeats month after month until either one becomes pregnant or reaches menopause. Now let's finish up with this slide. So if after ovulation, in the time around ovulation, a woman has had sex, sperm has been deposited in the vagina, that's when she can become pregnant. So fertilization is when a single sperm cell enters the egg cell. This happens in the oviduct. So those sperm cells that are released in the vagina need to make their way all the way through the cervix, all the way through the uterus, all the way up into the fallopian tube in order to fertilize an egg. That's a long journey for a tiny microscopic sperm cell. The vast majority don't make it. They are sort of attracted to chemicals released by the egg cell. That's how they find the egg cell. There are also changes within a woman's body around ovulation that make it easier for sperm cells to reach the egg. Mucus in the vagina and in the uterus changes its consistency so that it's easier for sperm cells to swim through it. Fertilization has to happen within about 24 hours of ovulation. Otherwise, the egg will disintegrate, will break down. But if it is fertilized in the oviduct, it starts to grow. What's the very first stage called? What do we call a fertilized egg? Zygote. As that zygote grows into 2 cells and 4 cells, goes through this process we call cleavage. What type of cell division is responsible for that? What type of cell division takes a zygote, turns it into an embryo? I want to hear from somebody new. You only have 2 choices. Caitlin? Meiosis? Everyone agree? Anyone disagree? What do you think? All right, why? Mitosis.
Because it's getting bigger.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, so it is mitosis. So meiosis, remember, only produces a sperm and egg cell. After that zygote is formed, it turns into 2 cells by mitosis. They turn into 4 cells, and 8 cells, and 16 cells. As that embryo's moving through the oviduct, it continues to divide. It continues to divide through mitosis. Eventually it gets into the uterus, and that's where it attaches to the wall of the uterus. Skip ahead for a minute. So, it eventually makes its way, and it attaches. This is the wall of the uterus. And tissue from the fetus grows into the wall of the uterus, and this is what forms the placenta. Okay. As it attaches, that's when gastrulation starts to happen. That hollow ball of cells starts to form that indentation. It's when the endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm start to form. Okay. An outer layer of cells becomes the placenta. And again, that's where material are going to diffuse in and out between the mother and the embryo. Another layer forms, the amnion, or the amniotic sac. This is what's filled with fluid, cushioning the embryo and fetus as it grows, protecting it. Okay? See, this is the amnion around a very early stage of an embryo. There's also a tiny little yolk sac in the very early stages. This provides the first source of energy and blood cells for the embryo until the other organs can sort of take over. The umbilical cord starts to form. This is the umbilical cord. It means 2 arteries and a vein carrying the blood from this embryo out here to the placenta, where nutrients can be exchanged between the mother's blood and the embryo's blood. Remember though, the blood doesn't mix. Blood from the mother doesn't go into the embryo, it just goes near it. Now there are times when if a couple's having trouble conceiving a child, where they may use in vitro fertilization. In vitro fertilization, when they remove an egg cell from a mother's ovary, a sperm cell from the father, and they fertilize the egg cell in the lab, in a petri dish, and then allow that zygote to divide a couple times and form a small embryo. They can then take that embryo and implant it back into a woman's uterus, and she'll become pregnant with that child. This can be done also to screen embryos, to make sure they don't have any genetic abnormalities. For example, in Huntington's disease. If a woman had Huntington's disease, they could do in vitro fertilization to produce embryos, screen those embryos to see which contain the Huntington's gene and which don't, and then they could only implant one that did not have the disease back into her uterus, ensuring that child won't have Huntington's disease. Another fact about fertilization, as soon as a single sperm cell enters the outer layer of the egg cell, there's an immediate chemical change to the outer layer, which makes it impervious to any other sperm cells. So that's why only a single sperm cell can fertilize the egg cell. Otherwise, if 3 or 4 sperm cells got in, it would have the incorrect chromosome number, wouldn't be able to develop. So there's a change that happens once a single sperm cell actually penetrates the egg. All right, well, I guess we'll pick up there on the next slide next time. Any questions? Awful quiet today.